Hi guys, for a channel that rails against all things considered woke, Talk TV's Mike Graham, the concrete farmer, was certainly triggered by comments the Mayor of London made recently about the problems of Brexit. Mike was with some guests who were clearly Brexiteers, and they branded Sadiq Khan plank or fool of the week, because he was rightly pointing out the immense damage leaving the EU and the single market was doing to the United Kingdom. Have a listen to this.
It turns out that he's made a speech last night in which he's called for the immense damage that Brexit is doing to the country to be reversed, and he wants now for a pragmatic debate to take place on rejoining the European Union and the single market. And you just think, sorry, you know, so we've already had the democratic referendum, we've already voted.
Sorry, you already had a democratic referendum. So, what's the problem with democracy? If a majority of the public support rejoining the EU, shouldn't that be respected? You know, you can't say, I respect democracy, but people shouldn't be allowed to change their mind. People shouldn't be allowed to have another referendum. Because if you have another referendum and people say, no, we'd prefer to stay out, then that should be respected. And then in another few years, people have another referendum and they decide, actually, we'd prefer to stay out again. That should be respected. And then maybe sometime in the future, people vote to rejoin. That should be respected. That's democracy. It's like, you don't vote once in the 1800s and say, this is the party for the rest of time. That wouldn't be considered acceptable. So why is it we have a referendum once and that's it? Because he's a Brexiteer, that's why.
Voted to leave, we've already done all that, everybody can argue about. But I mean, what you can't do is look at what's going on in the EU and go, oh, I wish we were more like France or Germany or Spain.
Okay, once again, and this is a big problem Brexiteers seem to have. They're not able to differentiate between individual European countries and the EU. They're not able to say, okay, we have a problem with the EU, and say, okay, let's look at France. France is not the EU. Germany is not the EU. They are members of the EU, but they're not the EU. But let's play his game. Because it says here, G7 real GDP change compared to pre-pandemic levels. And you can see the UK at -8 here. This is from 2019 to 2022. Germany, 0.3. France 1.1, Italy 1.8, Eurozone average 2.2%. Okay, so I don't know why he's comparing the UK with France and Germany and claiming that they're in a worse position when they're obviously not. But once again, it's pointless comparing the UK with Germany or the UK with France and pretending that this is something to do with the EU. The EU is 27 nations. Completely different economies. It's comparing apples and oranges. Either Mike doesn't understand this or he's pretending not to understand this. Maybe it's a bit of both.
Or Italy, where their economies are actually in worse state than ours, where, you know, politically they're nowhere, and where...
What do you mean politically they're nowhere? France has had its president for I don't know how long. Germany has just had an election, I think a year or a year and a half ago, and they replaced their prime minister or their chancellor. And Italy had an election recently, and they changed their prime minister. The new prime minister, we've had one prime minister here in Italy for a longer period of time than the UK has had a prime minister. The UK in 2022 went through 3 prime ministers, and you're talking about Italy? I think Mike needs to take his head out of his behind.
Where actually during COVID they did a lot worse than we did. So I don't know what you...
What do you mean they did worse than we did in respect to COVID? What do you mean worse? What is the definition of worse? A higher number of cases? But what's that got to do with the EU? If you're comparing deaths, then the UK did worse. But I said this on numerous occasions. I never treated the pandemic as some sort of race, some sort of competition. I know Brexiteers did when things were not going very well in certain European countries. That, of course, point the finger and say, look, the EU is bad because things are not going well in European countries. Of course, we have to remember that, excuse me, the pandemic pretty much started in Italy. It was ground zero. So Italy was, of course, suffering at the beginning of this pandemic. But once again, it's not a race, okay? And it's strange coming from people on Talk TV, because a lot of these people actually don't think there was a pandemic.
He's playing that. But he clearly has worked out that he's not going to be in charge of the Labour Party. He's basically trying to put pressure on Keir Starmer to make Labour change their position on the EU.
Maybe he's correct on that. That Sadiq Khan is saying, look, Brexit has been a disaster. The Labour Party needs to understand that and consider rejoining the EU. At the minute, the Labour Party aren't really talking about that. We know why, because they want to win power. And at the minute, Brexit isn't exactly a vote winner. Best to avoid talking about Brexit. I don't agree with that, but that seems to be the Labour Party's approach. But what Sadiq Khan is saying is not false. It's true. If you don't believe me, ask businesses that are trying to export into the single market. They will confirm that it's a disaster. Businesses have closed. Some businesses that have remained open, particularly smaller ones, have had to relocate, set up operations in countries like the Netherlands in order to continue to sell their goods. How is that winning? And once back to the first point he made, how is it anti-democratic giving people the choice to vote again? Isn't that pro-democracy? Maybe it's not for Brexiteers. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.